Now, Girard is a really interesting person. He begins as a historian. He moves to writing about French literature, but eventually he begins to think about religion. And as someone who comes from France, eventually he realizes he's going to have to deal with Christianity. It's in his heritage, it's in his cultural makeup. And even though he considers himself an agnostic at the very least, he now realizes he's going to have to apply his theories to the religious story in the Christian tradition. And so he does that. What he finds there is something he didn't expect. Because what he finds is a religion that at one time shows everything he expects. The generative scapegoat mechanism, the ways that we systematize violence in order to maintain the peace within the social group. But in the Christ story, he sees a story that undermines the entire premise of the scapegoat. And this is really fascinating. It really blows his mind. It changes everything about how he thinks about the world, the universe, and theology. And it's really where I come into the story as a pastor and a theologian who's intrigued by how these ideas interact with our Christian story today. But what Girard realizes is that in the Christ story, you have a narrative that is identifying not with the mob who needs a scapegoat, but with the victim all the way along through the tale. And this is something that really opens his eyes. That Christianity is not actually reinforcing the beauty and the importance and the significance of the scapegoat. It's actually building toward the point where God would release us from our need for an outsider. That Jesus is the one who comes along and says there is no more outsider, and therefore becomes the one that we turn all our violence against. And this is what is so important about Christianity. It's not that Christ is a good sacrifice or a better sacrifice or a perfect sacrifice that finally appeases God. It's the fact that Christianity is God playing into our perceived need for a sacrifice, specifically so that God can undermine it and free us from it. So the Christ comes, and this is where Girard, I think, really is an Orthodox Christian here, because he will say, as we've talked about, that every human being is naturally socialized into a world that needs scapegoats and outsiders. That's our original sin. It's bred into us from the moment we begin to see the world around us and imitate all of the human beings that surround us. And so we all owe a debt to scapegoating. We all owe a debt to violence. There's no way for us to escape that because it's just part of the air that we breathe as soon as we are born into the world. But Christ comes from outside the story. Christ really is the divine man who steps into the story and has absolutely no debt to scapegoating, no debt to violence, no debt to evil, no debt to anything but a very pure desire to imitate the Father. Jesus doesn't need to triangulate desire. Jesus actually desires what his Father shows him. And so when Jesus moves through the world, there is no violence, there is no scapegoating. That Jesus doesn't need to push anyone else away. In fact, all of Jesus' parables, all of his teaching are constantly telling us, hey, guys, there is no outsider. And because of that, specifically because Jesus threatens everything that maintains our peace and maintains our social order, unconsciously we become very threatened by him. And so we direct all of our violence and our hatred towards the outsider on the one who tells us that there is no more outsider. And when we scapegoat Jesus, when we direct all of that violence towards God, we are then allowed to enact all of our worst, most violent fantasies out on Jesus. We crucify him, we scapegoat him, the Jews do it, the Romans do it. Specifically in the story, there is no people group, there's no ethnic group, there's no small group of people that you can point to and say they are the villains here. It's literally everyone in the story who turns on Jesus at the climactic moment. Even his disciples turn on Jesus, they abandon Jesus, they scapegoat Jesus in the end. But the narrative doesn't identify with the mob. It identifies with the Christ. It identifies with Jesus in the midst of that. And because of that, Girard's eyes become opened and he realizes that Christianity is doing something fundamentally new in the history of the human story. It's telling us that no longer do we need a scapegoat. And this is the really profound thing about the Christian story, because it goes right to the heart of the scapegoat mechanism and it unveils the fatal flaw in the system. The scapegoating only works if you believe in it. You have to actually believe that the person is the problem. If you know that really they're not your enemy, they're not the problem, you're just scapegoating them to make you feel better about yourself, well then the whole thing falls apart like a house of cards. Scapegoating somebody only works if you actually believe that they're the problem. And when Christ comes and tells us, listen, there is no more outsider, and we are able to direct all of our violence and hatred towards him, and we do our worst to him, but in that climactic moment, Jesus does not return hatred to us. Jesus on the cross says, I forgive you. You don't even know what you're doing. It's like our eyes are opened in that moment.